There is an hour of the night the church has never spoken of lightly, not midnight, not dawn. A narrow window, somewhere between 3 and 4 in the morning, that ancient monks called the hour of greatest darkness. 2. And if you have ever woken suddenly in that hour, heart pounding, room silent, no reason you can name, I need you to listen to what I am about to tell you, because it is not an accident. For centuries, cloistered religious have risen in the deep of night, not at dawn, not at a reasonable hour, but in the black stillness before sunrise, to pray matins, to stand watch. Ask any monk why. Pooh, and he will not talk about tradition. He will talk about warfare. He will tell you that the hours before light are not empty. They are contested. Scripture itself marks this time with unease. 2. The Gospels tell us Christ agonized in the garden through the night, sweating blood, while his apostles could not stay awake, as if something in that hour worked to close their eyes. Psalms speak of the terror of the night and the arrow that flies by day as two different things, two different enemies. One seen, one not. So what happens in that hour? 2. Why do hospitals report more deaths near it than any other time? Why do the Desert Fathers, the mystics, the exorcists across centuries, different eras, different continents, no communication between them, all point to the same narrow stretch of darkness? Stay with me, because by the end of this, you will never look at that hour of the night the same way again. Before we continue, 2. Subscribe to Ripperger Insights and turn on notifications, because these powerful messages are meant for those who seek truth and deeper understanding. The hour no one speaks of long before science. Before clocks divided the night into equal hours, the men and women who gave their lives entirely to prayer already knew something the rest of the world did not. They knew that not all darkness is the same darkness. Walk into any Trappist monastery today, and you will find monks rising while the world sleeps. Not at 5, not at 6, but often earlier, into that deep well of night when even nocturnal creatures grow still. 2. They call it vigils. Some call it matins. And if you ask an old monk why the church built an entire office of prayer around this specific stretch of night, he will not shrug and say tradition for tradition's sake. 2. He will lower his voice, and he will tell you, because something moves in that hour. I want you to sit with that for a moment. 2. Because we live in an age that has convinced us the world is fully explained, that darkness is simply the absence of light, nothing more, nothing hidden within it. But the saints did not believe that. 2. The Desert Fathers, who fled into the wilderness of Egypt in the 3rd and 4th centuries specifically to do battle with the enemy, did not believe that. They wrote extensively of demons who attacked most fiercely not at midnight, not at dawn, but in that narrow, aching stretch before the sky begins to change. 2. They called it the noonday devil's twin, a darkness that presses on the soul precisely when the body is weakest, when the mind is most alone, when resistance is lowest. Think now of the Garden of Gethsemane. Scripture tells us that Christ went there in the deep of night, taking Peter, James, and John with him, and he said to them, "My soul is sorrowful even unto death. Stay here and watch with me." And what happened? They fell asleep. Not once. 3 times he returned to find them sleeping, unable to keep their eyes open, even as their Lord sweat blood in agony only steps away. Ask yourself, why? These were fishermen, grown men, no strangers to long nights on the water. Why, in the presence of the Son of God agonizing before them, could they not stay awake? Some of the fathers of the church suggest something unsettling, that it was not ordinary exhaustion that closed their eyes that night. That the same darkness pressing upon Christ was, in some mysterious way, pressing upon them too, dulling them, drawing a veil over their spirits at the exact moment they were most needed. 2. If that is true, if there is a spiritual weight to certain hours of the night that can act upon the soul even without our awareness, then what does that mean for you, waking suddenly at 3 in the morning, heart racing for no reason you can explain? The Psalms do not let us dismiss this lightly either. Psalm 91, a psalm so associated with spiritual protection that it has been prayed by soldiers, exorcists, too, and the dying for 2,000 years, draws a very deliberate distinction. Thou shalt not be afraid of the terror of the night, of the arrow that flieth in the day. Read that again slowly. Two different threats. Two different natures of attack. One that flies visibly in daylight, that can be seen and dodged and understood, and one that comes in the terror of the night, unseen, formless. Two, striking not the body but something deeper. Why would the psalmist bother to separate them if they were the same thing? This is where I need you to stay with me. Two, because what I'm about to walk through is not superstition, and it is not fear for the sake of fear. It is something the church has quietly held on to for 2,000 years, something written into her very liturgy. Two, something exorcists across centuries and across continents, men who never met each other, who spoke different languages, who lived in different centuries, have all, independently, pointed toward the same conclusion. Two, there is a reason cloistered religious pray through the night. There is a reason ancient monasteries built their entire rhythm of life around rising in the hours before dawn to stand as spiritual sentries. Two, they were not simply disciplining their bodies. They believed and taught that the night has watches, the way a besieged city has watches. Two, and that someone must be awake and praying while the rest of the world sleeps defenseless. And if that is true, then ask yourself the question that should be sitting in your chest right now. Who is standing watch for you? Because most of us are not monks. We do not rise at 3 a.m. to chant psalms in a cold stone chapel. We sleep defenseless through the very hour tradition tells us is most contested, and we wake sometimes with our hearts pounding, in a silence that feels somehow occupied, and we tell ourselves it was nothing, just a dream, just stressance. Two, just the body doing what bodies do. But what if it isn't just that? What if the ancient wisdom of the church, the vigils, the psalms, the desert fathers? Two, the warnings passed down through centuries of men who wrestled with darkness directly. What if all of it was trying to tell us something that we, in our modern comfort, have simply stopped listening to? Two, stay with me, because in the next part, I want to show you exactly what the church believed was happening in that hour, and why the answer is far stranger and far more hopeful than you might expect. Two, the watches of the night to understand why the church built her prayer around this hour. You have to go back further than the monasteries. Two, you have to go back to the way the ancient world itself understood the night. In the time of Christ, the night was not one undivided stretch of darkness. It was divided into watches, set periods, each with its own name, each guarded by a soldier whose duty was to stay alert while the city around him slept. The Gospel of Mark records Christ himself using this structure when he warns his disciples to be ready, saying they do not know when the master of the house will come, at even, or at midnight, or at the cock crowing, or in the morning. 4 watches, 4 distinct segments of vigilance carved out of the dark. 2. Why does this matter? Because the early church did not discard this structure, she baptized it. She took the pagan world's practical division of night watches and transformed it into something sacred. To the divine office, prayed at set hours through day and night, a chain of prayer that never breaks, hour to hour, monastery to monastery, century to century. And of all those hours, one carried a weight the others did not. The watch just before the cockcrow, the deepest hour, the hour when the body's defenses are lowest, when sleep is heaviest, when the mind is furthest from waking reason. 2. This is the hour the monks called vigils. Vigil, from the Latin vigia, meaning watchfulness, meaning someone is awake so that evil does not move unchallenged. Now, I want to ask you something. And I want you to actually sit with the question rather than rushing past it. Why would a church that teaches Christ has already conquered sin and death. Why would that same church insist, century after century, generation after generation, that someone must remain physically awake, praying through the darkest hour of night? The answer the fathers give us is not comfortable. It is this: victory has been won, but the battle has not ended. Christ's triumph on the cross broke the power of darkness permanently, but Scripture is clear that darkness has not yet been fully silenced in this world. St. Peter himself writes it plainly, and I want you to hear the weight of his words. Be sober, be vigilant, because your adversary the devil, as a roaring lion, walketh about, seeking whom he may devour. Be vigilant. The very word the monks built their night prayer around. Peter is not describing an abstract, symbolic danger. He is describing a walking, seeking, prowling reality, one that does not rest simply because the world has gone to sleep. And where does a lion hunt? Not in daylight, when prey is alert and watching. A lion hunts in the dark, too, when the herd's guard is down. This is why, across cultures and centuries, the deep night carries such a universal weight of dread that even secular medicine has had to acknowledge it without being able to explain it. 2. Hospitals have long observed what nurses call the witching hour of mortality, a measurable spike in deaths occurring in the hours before dawn, more than at any other point in the 24-hour cycle. 2. Doctors will offer you biological explanations, cortisol levels, circadian rhythms, the body's lowest point of physiological resilience. And those explanations are not wrong. But ask yourself, why would the body itself, across every culture, every era, be built to reach its weakest ebb in precisely the hour the Church has, for 2,000 years, called the hour of spiritual battle? 2. Coincidence explains a pattern once. It does not explain a pattern that repeats across medicine, scripture, monastic tradition, and the testimony of exorcists who have never read each other's work. I think of the words of Christ in the garden one more time, because they will not leave me alone. Could ye not watch with me 1 hour? He asked Peter, not accusing, but almost grieving. 1 hour. 2. That is all he asked. And they could not give it because something in that hour worked against them even as they tried. If the apostles, men who had walked with Christ, who had seen him raise the dead, 2, who loved him enough to draw swords in his defense hours later, could not stay awake through that 1 hour of trial, what makes us think we are simply exempt, sleeping unguarded through it every single night of our lives? This is not meant to frighten you into paralysis. I need you to hear that clearly. 2, because that is not what the saints intended when they rose in the dark to pray. They did not rise because they were terrified. They rose because they understood something we have largely forgotten. That vigilance is not fear, it is love standing guard. A mother does not check on her sleeping child at 3 a.m. because she is consumed with dread. She does it because she loves that child enough to remain aware, even when awareness costs her sleep. That is what vigils was. That is what the whole night office of the Church still is, prayed today in monasteries scattered across the world while the rest of us sleep. It is love. 2, keeping watch. But here is the question I need you to carry into the next part with me, because it is the question that changes everything. If the saints believed this hour required a guard, 2, and if fewer and fewer people today even know these prayers exist, who exactly is standing watch now? If this message is touching your heart, take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Ripperger Insights. 2, and share this message with someone who needs to hear it. What the desert father's canoe to answer that question? Who stands watch now? We have to go back to the men who first went looking for the answer themselves. 2, not theologians in comfortable studies. Men who left everything, walked into the Egyptian desert with nothing, and waited for the darkness to come to them on purpose. 2, the desert fathers of the 3rd and 4th centuries were not gentle men living quiet lives of contemplation, the way we sometimes imagine monks today. They were spiritual soldiers who had gone looking for a fight. 2. St. Anthony of Egypt, the father of Christian monasticism, is recorded by his biographer Athanasius as enduring nights of such violent spiritual assault that he was later found by companions beaten and barely alive. Not by any human hand, but by something his own body bore the marks of in the dead of night, alone in his cell. Athanasius does not dress this up as metaphor. He writes it as history, as something that happened in the dark to a man who had done nothing but pray. Why does this matter to you, sitting wherever you are right now, centuries removed from an Egyptian desert cell? Because Anthony did not simply endure this and move on. 2. He studied it. He and the fathers who came after him began to notice patterns, that certain hours brought certain kinds of attack, that the mind grew weary and vulnerable to despair and terror in specific, repeatable windows of the night, most severely in the hours before dawn. They gave this a name that has survived in spiritual literature for over 1,000 years, acedia. 2. Sometimes called the noonday devil for its daytime form, but recognized in its nighttime form as something heavier still, a spirit of dread, of hopelessness, of accusation that presses hardest when a person is most alone and most tired. Think about the last time you woke suddenly in the deep of night, 2, and your mind, before you could stop it, went immediately to your worst fear, a regret you thought you'd buried, a relationship you'd failed, a sin you thought you'd left behind long ago, suddenly vivid again, accusing you in a silence that felt somehow deliberate. You have likely told yourself this was simply anxiety, the mind idling without distraction, and it may well be exactly that. 2. But the Desert Fathers would ask you to consider something further. They taught that the accuser, and Scripture itself names Satan this way, ho diabolos, the one who throws a cross, the one who accuses, does his most effective work not through spectacle, but through whispers, timed precisely to our weakest moments. Revelation 12 tells us he is the accuser of our brethren, who accused them before our God day and night, not resting. Ask yourself honestly, when in your life have accusing thoughts against yourself felt loudest? For most people, if they are honest, the answer is the same. Not at noon, surrounded by the business of the day, in the dark, alone, early. This is precisely why the Fathers structured monastic life the way they did. Not out of superstition, but out of hard-won, repeated experience. They discovered that prayer offered in that hour did something. It did not merely comfort the one praying. It seemed to break something, too, to hold a line that would otherwise be overrun. St. John Cassian, who studied under these very Desert Fathers and later brought their teaching to the West, too, wrote extensively about the necessity of vigilance precisely because he had seen and experienced what happened in its absence. And this is where I want to bring you back to Scripture one final time in this part, because there is a detail in the Gospels that is so easy to read past, and yet it may be the most important detail of all. When Peter denies Christ 3 times in the courtyard of the high priest, 2, Scripture tells us with striking precision that it happened as the night wore toward dawn, and immediately after his 3rd denial, the cock crew. 2. The rooster's call marks the boundary of that final watch, the very watch the monks would later call vigils, the hour of deepest darkness before light returns. Peter's greatest failure, his most devastating collapse, happens in that hour, not at midday, in the crowd, under scrutiny, in the dark, exhausted, afraid, alone in a way that had nothing to do with the people around him. Is that a coincidence? Ask yourself honestly. Peril, too. The same apostle who could not stay awake to pray with Christ in the garden a few hours earlier is the same apostle who, hours later, in that same deep night window, denies him 3 times before the rooster's cry breaks the darkness. Twice in one night, in the very hours the church would later structure her prayer around, Peter fails, not from a lack of love. 2, He loved Christ enough to draw a sword for him. He fails because something in that hour worked against his strength precisely when his strength was lowest. 2. If it happened to Peter, the rock on which Christ built his church, what makes any of us think we are somehow beyond its reach? This is not despair I am handing you. It is a map. 2. The Desert Fathers did not simply identify the danger and stop there. They discovered the answer. And in the next part, 2, I want to show you exactly what that answer was, because it changes everything about how you should think of the hour you wake, alone in the dark. 2, the answer hidden in the darkness told you at the end of the last part that this was not despair I was handing you. It was a map. So let me show you where that map leads. Because the Desert Fathers who suffered so violently in the dark did not simply catalog their wounds and walk away defeated. They found something, too. And what they found is so simple that the modern mind, trained to expect complexity, almost refuses to believe it could be enough. The answer was presence, not cleverness. Not a formula of words repeated like a charm. Presence, the deliberate, disciplined choice to remain spiritually awake and turn toward God precisely in the hour the enemy hoped to find them turned away. St. Anthony, after his most violent nights of assault, did not flee the desert. He stayed. And tradition holds that after one of his fiercest trials, when he had been left broken on the floor of his cell, a light filled the space and he heard, or understood in prayer, that Christ had been present all along, watching, and had allowed the trial to test him, waiting for the moment Anthony would cry out. "Where were you?" Anthony is said to have asked. And the answer he received was not an excuse. It was a promise. "I was here, watching your struggle. Because you did not give in, I will be your helper forever." 2, hold that phrase for a moment. I was here, not absent, not indifferent to the hour, present, watching even in the deepest dark, and waiting not to prevent the struggle, but to be sought within it. 2, this is the theological heart of everything the church built around the night watches. Christ does not promise his followers a life free of the dark hour. He promises himself within it. Remember what the psalmist himself wrote after naming the terror of the night. He did not end there in dread. He continued, "For he shall give his angels charge over thee, to keep thee in all thy ways." 2. Protection is promised in the very psalm that names the danger. The two are inseparable in Scripture, the acknowledgement of the threat and the assurance of a guard set against it. This is why the monastic office of vigils was never framed by the church as an act of fear. It was framed as an act of love returned. Christ asked his apostles in Gethsemane, "Could ye not watch with me 1 hour?" 2. And for 2,000 years, in monasteries scattered across every continent, men and women have risen in the coldest, darkest part of the night, specifically to answer that question with a yes that the apostles, in their exhaustion, could not give. Every night, somewhere in the world, someone is keeping the watch Peter, James, and John could not keep. The chain has never fully broken. 2. But what does this mean for you? Someone who is not a monk, who does not rise for vigils, who simply finds themselves awake in that hour by accident, heart pounding, mind racing toward fear before you're even fully conscious. Here is what the tradition would tell you, and I want you to receive it not as a rule, but as an invitation. That waking is not meaningless. 2. Whether it comes from stress, from the body's chemistry, from nothing you can name, the moment you find yourself alert in that hour is an opportunity the saints would have recognized immediately. Not a moment to fear, but a moment to turn. Even a single line of prayer, "Jesus, I trust in you," or simply the sign of the cross made slowly, deliberately, in the dark, was understood by the fathers as an act of tremendous spiritual weight, precisely because it is offered at the hour when offering it costs the most. Prayer prayed easily, in comfort, in daylight, is good. But prayer prayed in that hour, against exhaustion, against fear, against the temptation to simply roll over and let dread win, That prayer the tradition holds is prayer of a different order entirely. Consider the widow's mite. Christ tells his disciples that the poor widow who gave 2 small coins gave more than all the wealthy who gave from their abundance, because she gave of her want, even all her living. 2. The hour of deepest night operates the same way, spiritually speaking. A prayer offered from exhaustion, from fear, from the very depth of human weakness, is not a lesser prayer because it is difficult to give. 2. It is a greater one because it costs everything the person has left. This is why the fathers did not merely endure the night hour, they came to treasure it. St. John Climacus, too, writing centuries later in his Ladder of Divine Ascent, describes the tears and the struggle of nighttime prayer not as punishment, but as purification. A furnace in which the soul is refined precisely because nothing else is watching, nothing else is applauding. No one else will ever know what was fought and won in that hour except God alone. And here, I think, too, is the deepest truth hidden inside this ancient teaching, the one I want you to carry forward with you. The hour that seems to expose your weakness most is the very hour God has chosen, across every century of the Church's life, to draw closest to those who call to Him, not despite the darkness within it. But knowing this raises a harder question, one the saints themselves wrestled with for years before finding peace. If God is present in that hour, waiting to be sought, why does He allow the terror to come at all? 2. Why not simply remove the trial rather than stand within it? That is where we must go next. Because the answer the Church gives is not what you expect, and it may be the most important truth in this entire message. Why God allows the darkness? Why does God allow the terror of the night at all? If He is sovereign, if He loves us as Scripture says He does, why not simply remove the trial rather than stand within it, watching, while we shake in the dark? This is the question every saint who wrote honestly about suffering eventually had to face. And I want to tell you plainly, the Church has never pretended the answer is easy. But she has never left us without one either. Look again at the book of Job, a book written specifically to wrestle with this exact question. Job, a righteous man, is stripped of everything, his wealth, his children, his health, and Scripture tells us plainly that this happened with God's permission, though not God's cruelty. Satan appears before God and asks leave to test Job, and God grants it, within limits He Himself sets. Notice what that means. The accuser does not act freely, unbound, doing whatever he wishes. He acts on a leash held firmly in the hand of God. Nothing touches Job, and by extension, too, nothing touches you, not even in the darkest hour of the night, without passing first through hands that love you infinitely more than you love yourself. This is not a small comfort. It is, I would argue, the entire foundation on which the Church's teaching on suffering rests. The night terror you feel, the accusing thought that comes uninvited at 3 a.m, the dread that has no name, none of it is outside the permission of a God who could silence it instantly and does not always choose to do so immediately. Why? St. Paul gives us perhaps the most personal answer in all of Scripture. He writes of a thorn in the flesh, the angel of Satan, to buffet me, a trial he begged God 3 times to remove. 2, and God's answer was not removal, it was this: my grace is sufficient for thee, for my strength is made perfect in infirmity. Read that again. Perfected, not despite the weakness, through it. Paul goes on to say something that should stop us cold. Most gladly, therefore, will I glory in my infirmities, that the power of Christ may rest upon me. The very thing Paul begged God to take away became, in time, the place where he most clearly felt God's power resting on him. This is the pattern the entire spiritual tradition of the Church points to again and again across every century. 2. The trial is not evidence of abandonment. It is paradoxically often the very place where the deepest union with God becomes possible, because it is in weakness, not in strength, that we stop relying on ourselves and start reaching genuinely, desperately for Him. Think of Gethsemane one final time, because it is the key that unlocks everything we've walked through together. Christ Himself, true God and true man, entered that hour of deepest darkness and did not have it removed. He asked the Father, "If it be possible, let this cup pass from me." And the cup did not pass. The Father, who could have ended the agony in an instant, chose instead to send an angel to strengthen him within it. Not escape from the trial, strength to endure it. And it was precisely in that endurance, in that yet, not as I will, but as thou wilt, that the redemption of the entire world was accomplished. If the Son of God Himself was not exempted from the terror of that hour, what makes us think we should be? 2. And if strength was given to Him not by removing the trial, but by standing with Him inside it, is that not exactly the same promise held out to us every single night in our own smaller Gethsemanes? This reframes everything. The hour you fear is not proof that God has stepped back. It may, in fact, be the very place He has drawn nearest, because it is there, in the collapse of our own strength, that we finally stop performing faith and start living it, raw and unguarded, exactly as we are. I think of the words the Lord spoke to St. Faustina in the 20th century, words that have brought comfort to millions who struggle in the night. Let the greatest sinners place their trust in my mercy, not the strong, not the composed, the ones who feel in the deep of night most exposed, most afraid, most far from holiness. That is precisely where He says He can be found. So when you wake, heart-pounding, mind-racing, in that hour tradition has feared and revered for 2,000 years, I want you to remember what we have uncovered together. The fear is real. The tradition behind it is not superstition. 2, it is the hard-won wisdom of men and women who faced that hour directly and lived to write about it. But the fear was never meant to be the final word. 2, it was meant to be the doorway into the one thing every saint discovered, often only after years of struggle, that the darkest hour of the night is not the hour God is furthest from you. It is more often than not the hour He is waiting closest for you to simply turn and call His name. And that turning, small, costly, offered from exhaustion rather than strength, is the subject I want to close with. 2, because there is one more piece of this puzzle, one final teaching passed down from the saints, that tells you exactly what to do the next time you find yourself awake in that hour. Stay with me for the final part. 2, because this is the part that changes how you will sleep and wake for the rest of your life. What to do. When the darkness comes, we have walked a long road together to arrive here, through the deserts of Egypt, through the courtyard where a rooster's cry broke a man's heart, through a garden where the Son of God sweat blood and was not spared the hour. And now I want to give you what every saint who faced that darkness eventually learned to carry with them. Not a theory, but a practice. Not an explanation, but a weapon. 2, because knowledge without action changes nothing. You can understand everything I have told you and still lie awake tonight, heart pounding at 3 in the morning, and do nothing but suffer through it as you always have. So let me give you what the tradition actually handed down, the concrete, simple, tested response the Church has offered her children for 2,000 years in this exact hour. The first thing the fathers would tell you is this: name what is happening. Do not let the moment pass unexamined, dismissed automatically as just anxiety or just a bad dream, even if that is, in the end, exactly what it is. Bring it consciously before God. Even a whispered, "Lord, I don't know what this is, but I bring it to you," is itself an act of the very vigilance the monks practiced for centuries. You do not need Latin. You do not need a formula memorized perfectly. You need only turn your face in the dark toward the one who has already told you. He is present in it. The second thing is the sign of the cross, made slowly and deliberately rather than rushed. 2, this is not superstition. It is one of the oldest prayers of the Church, older than most written texts we possess. A physical confession of the central truth of the Christian faith made with your own body in the very hour your body feels weakest. The early Christians made this sign upon waking, before sleeping, before any task. 2. Specifically because they believed, and the Church has never stopped teaching, that it carries real spiritual weight. 2. Marking the one who makes it as belonging to Christ in a moment when belonging feels most in question. The third is Scripture itself, and specifically the psalm we have returned to throughout this message, Psalm 91. The fathers called it the soldier's psalm, prayed by those going into battle, prayed by the dying, prayed by exorcists at the bedside of the tormented. You do not need to recite it from memory. Even a single line, "He that dwelleth in the aid of the Most High." 2. Shall abide under the protection of the God of Jacob. Spoken quietly into the dark has been treasured by the Church for 2 millennia as a shield raised precisely in the hour it is most needed. 2. And the fourth, the one I want to leave you with most of all, is this: do not fight the hour alone if you do not have to. Every saint who conquered the terror of the night did so within the life of the Church. 2. Not outside it. Confession, the Eucharist, the ordinary sacramental life that so many of us treat as optional rather than as the armor it actually is. These are not decorations on the Christian life. They are, according to the constant teaching of the Church, the very means by which grace is poured into a soul, fortifying it before the hour of trial ever arrives. A soul in a state of grace, close to the sacraments, does not face that hour the same way a soul who has drifted from them does. This is not fear-mongering. It is simply what the Church has always taught, and what the saints, without exception, testify to from their own experience. I think back one final time to Gethsemane, because it is where this entire message must end. Christ asked 3 men to stay awake with him for 1 hour, and they could not. But notice, he did not abandon them for their failure. He woke them gently. He forgave them before they even asked. And hours later, after the darkest night any of them would ever know, he rose. 2. The hour of terror was not the end of the story. It was the doorway into the dawn. That is the truth I want you to carry with you tonight, and every night after this one. The hour you fear. 3. 4 in the morning, the silence that feels occupied, the heart that pounds for no reason you can name, is not evidence that you have been left alone in the dark. It is. 2. If the whole of Scripture and 2,000 years of the Church's wisdom are to be believed, the very hour where the nearness of God to the suffering soul has always been most fiercely real. 2. Not because the fear isn't real, but because His presence within it is more real still. So the next time you wake in that hour, I do not want you to reach first for your phone. 2. Or to lie there, letting dread build unchallenged in the silence. I want you to remember everything we have walked through together. Anthony in his cell, Peter in the courtyard, Paul with his thorn, Christ himself in the garden. And I want you to do what every one of them, in the end, discovered was the only answer that ever truly held. Turn toward the dark and say His name. You are not alone in that hour. 2. You never were succeed to Ripperger insights for more powerful spiritual insights, hidden revelations, and messages that inspire faith and reflection. Join this community and continue seeking the truth. 2. If this message stirred something in you tonight, don't let it end here. Like this video so others can find it. Share it with someone who struggles in the dark hours, someone who needs to know they are not alone. 2. And in the comments below, tell us, has this hour ever found you awake? We read every story, and we would be honored to hear yours. Until next time, stay watchful, stay faithful. 2. And may you never walk through the darkness without Him.